This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Hello there, welcome to this edition of Global Business Africa. In the next 60 minutes, we'll run through all the business news stories you need to know about from across the continent. Let's start with the run here through the markets for you. So July is not being particularly pleasant for Egyptian equities. EGX 30 closing almost half a percentage point lower today, continuing a slump that we've seen really carrying through from June. It's still 4.5% higher though on a year-to-date basis, even at today's levels. Nigeria's main index, however, not doing particularly well. There you go, down essentially about 0.2% today, but it's actually down 10.6% so far in the year, barely over 28,000 points. And the question everyone's asking is, why would you invest in Nigerian equities when bond yields are so good? Here's what's coming up tonight. Boris Johnson is naming a new cabinet after becoming the UK's Prime Minister. Kenya gets a new finance minister a day after the incumbent is charged with corruption. And why is the US Justice Department announcing an antitrust review of giant tech firms? We'll have the details on those and plenty more in the next hour or so. But let's start the bulletin in the United Kingdom, where Boris Johnson, ardent supporter of Britain's withdrawal from the European Union, has taken over as Prime Minister from Theresa May. Now, Johnson's new position projects an optimistic, some would say perhaps unfounded view of the country's future, despite the looming spectre of a hard Brexit. The new Prime Minister, a former Foreign Secretary, two-term Mayor of London, and a former journalist, is a very polarising figure. He's known for over-the-top displays and charismatic bluster that has connected with many voters, but also alienated quite a few others. Johnson promised to start work immediately on a series of policies that include putting more police officers on the streets, revitalising social care and strengthening the National Health Service.
It's taken a long time for Boris Johnson to get into 10 Downing Street. Getting to the top of British politics is no mean feat. If Boris Johnson has cultivated anything, it's a reputation for clowning.
Boris has won because everyone is sick and tired of career politicians, beige people who took us into that terrible financial crisis. Now we've got someone, we know who they are, they call a spade, and that's the kind of person we want leading us.
Childhood friends recall his appearance at school drama performances where, having failed to learn his part, he'd run across the stage from pillar to pillar where he'd stuck the script. Getting a laugh by not preparing is one of the criticisms levelled against him by critics here at Westminster.
Boris Johnson started his career as a journalist and was fired from his first job for making up a quote. He reported on the European Union from Brussels and was caught exaggerating and in some cases simply inventing stories. After moving into politics, Boris Johnson became London Mayor by winning over voters who didn't ordinarily vote for the Conservatives. His tenure as mayor saw the city host the Olympics and the introduction of its popular bicycle hire scheme, though both had been signed off before he took office. Git O'Harry was at Oxford University with Mr. Johnson and worked for him when he was mayor.
He is hugely intelligent, enormously charismatic, quite offbeat. He breaks the rules, he does the kind of things that people don't expect politicians, or certainly didn't in the old days, to do. He speaks what's on his mind.
Johnson's first chance to become Prime Minister came and went after the Brexit referendum. He was pronounced unfit for office by a political friend turned competitor. Former Prime Minister Theresa May then appointed Boris Johnson as Foreign Secretary. Critics say his inattention to detail in that job compounded the detention of a British woman imprisoned in Iran, where she remains. The episode didn't win him friends in the Foreign Office.
Would you like to see him as Prime Minister?
He would not be my first choice, no.
Second choice?
He may not even be in the top two.
Let's stop Downing Street, Boris.
Boris Johnson has become Britain's Prime Minister by campaigning as the outsider. Yet he is the ultimate insider a millionaire who went to the elite school Eton as well as Oxford University.
Mr Johnson's first job as leader will be to take his country out of the EU. Failure to deliver Brexit could add his name to the long list of Conservative leaders who've been brought down by party divisions over Europe. A new Prime Minister doesn't mean the old problems will disappear. Jamie Owen, CGTN, Westminster.
All right, then. Jamie Owen is in London now with the latest on this developing story. Jamie, I see that the Prime Minister is naming his cabinet. What's the latest on your end?
His cabinet. As we come on air, we are watching a wholesale change to the UK cabinet. I'm going to bring in our guest, Joe Twynham, in a minute, the political analyst, to talk a little more about that, because this is breaking as we come on air. I can tell you that the new Chancellor, the Finance Minister in the UK, is Sajid Javid, and the new Home Secretary is Priti Patel. But so far, we seem to be up to, we think, about 17 sackings, or at least 17 changes of personnel in the UK cabinet, which we think, we've been flicking back through the history books, is probably one of the biggest changes, if not the biggest change in British politics.
All right, then. Unfortunately, it seems we've lost that signal there from Jamie Owen in London. Now then, let's pay attention to something completely different, a bit of history as it was. The clock essentially was ticking out for the outgoing British Prime Minister Theresa May. She, of course, did meet with the Queen a little earlier to formally resign. We'll, of course, be looking back at her time in office in a bit more detail later on. But as we try and work on that signal to London, let's get a perspective from Brussels. Brexit, of course, is a thing that's looming large. Political declaration. But in essence, it seems like the EU is giving Boris the exact same offer they gave his predecessor, aren't they? Tweaks to political declaration, but no change to the withdrawal agreement.
Well, exactly, Rama. The EU really isn't changing its tune. But don't tell Boris that. You know, he's convinced that they can do a new deal with the EU, of course. And there's that threat by him that if Brussels, of course, refuses to negotiate, he's promised to take the UK out of the EU on October 31st without a deal and to keep the £39 billion divorce settlement. Now, you know, at this juncture, it really doesn't seem like the EU will, of course, bend in any way just because the UK has now changed its Prime Minister. The only deal is the deal that they have negotiated with the UK government. It may be the previous government, but for them, that is the only deal on the table. And the EU's default position is no renegotiation, unless, of course, the UK changes its red lines, things such as the customs union or perhaps signing up to the EU single market. Now, all Michel Barnier offered today was that he looked forward to knowing what Boris wants, whether it's an orderly Brexit or, of course, a no-deal Brexit. He did say, though, that he's looking forward to working constructively with the new government, but only to ratify the withdrawal agreement. And in Brussels, they will, of course, be prepared and be preparing for a new team of UK negotiators to really bluster in and force the EU's hand to get rid, of course, of that contentious Irish backstop. But the new guys might, of course, realise it's not all that easy, and that's what the EU is going to be betting on.
Indeed. So this man, Boris Johnson, I mean, he tends to lie about even the most basic of things. Most recently, last week, in fact, about fish packaging rules. The last week's Kipper incident is a prime example of this sort of thing. So from Brussels' perspective, how can negotiators like Michel Barnier approach negotiations with a man for whom facts really don't matter?
Well, you know, Rama, he might have lied, but he still became Prime Minister. You know, for Michel Barnier, you know, what he said earlier today was also quite telling. And for once, it might be one of the first times most people will have heard Boris Johnson being referred to as a clever man. That's what Michel Barnier said. So it seems as if Barnier knows that there is going to be a battle on the way, and he's not really presuming anything when it comes to Boris, and he's definitely not painting him as a clown. And to prepare, of course, for PM Boris, today there was even extraordinary meeting of the European Parliament's Brexit steering group, and that's made up of different MEPs across across the political divide, and they convene themselves with Michel Barnier. But from their statement as well, it seems, just like Barnier, they don't quite know what exactly is going to happen. They're still sort of wondering what this new UK government is going to do when it comes to Brexit. So they're adopting a kind of wait-and-see approach. They don't know what to expect, but perhaps it can't be worse than the past, well, according to some accounts. I'm going to leave you with this, Rama. So the EU Commission first Vice President, a man called Frans Timmermans, now he recently likened the UK negotiators to Dad's Army. Now that's a very old British TV sitcom, basically about hapless soldiers. And as his story goes, the EU said that they found these negotiators that they didn't really have any plan for Brexit. So, let's see what these next 99 days brings and if this new team can change maybe the EU's perception.
Well, we certainly live in interesting times. Let's see how that works out. Mariam Zaidi in Brussels. Thank you. Now then, let's pick up the story where we left it off in London. Jamie Owen has been covering developments on that end of the world. Jamie, what's the latest?
Well, breaking news. You join us in Westminster as Boris Johnson, in his first few hours as Britain's new Prime Minister, carries out a wholesale reshuffle of his cabinet. Let's get more on this with a political analyst, Joe Twynham, who joins me now. This is massive, isn't it?
It is. It's like saying that it's a factory reset rather than a reshuffle. It's an incredible change, the size of which is largely unprecedented in British political history. You do get, obviously, big changes when there's a change of government, but when the same party stays in power and the leader changes, we've never had anything of this size before.
Why is Boris Johnson carrying out this wholesale change of the top jobs?
It appears that Boris Johnson wants people who are completely on board with his vision, specifically on Brexit, to be in the key positions in his government. And so that means that even people who have supported him have been sacked today. And instead, the major jobs have gone to those arch loyalists who he hopes will really deliver on his vision.
And a quick word about the top names we know about, the new Chancellor. We have a new Chancellor.
Sajid Javid is the new Chancellor, Priti Patel, the new Home Secretary, and Dominic Raab, the new Foreign Secretary. These are all relatively unknown in British politics, but they've been promoted way beyond what a lot of people were expecting even a few weeks ago. It's a sensational event, and what it means for Boris Johnson's plans moving forward remains to be seen.
And just give us an idea of the danger that Boris Johnson is storing up by not making his first cabinet more inclusive, not bringing in more of his opponents who opposed Brexit. What might lie ahead for him in this decision this evening?
By having all the people in the cabinet behaving in a certain way, it means everyone that doesn't support them is out, but also outside of the kind of ministerial responsibility that we have in this country. That means you have to keep quiet, you have to support the government. Those people will be on the back benches, potentially creating havoc. And that's hugely important because Boris Johnson, despite his success, still only has a very, very slender majority in the Houses of Parliament.
Well, let's talk about that. The world's press are here. We can hear them all around us on channels all around the world. We've been talking about a new face, a new Prime Minister in Britain. The truth of the matter is, you know that ultimate power in the UK doesn't lie with the Prime Minister. It lies with those members of Parliament in the House of Commons behind us. And those sums, that mathematics, has not changed today.
No, it has not. There has been a change at number 10. There has been a change in government. But in terms of the parliamentary arithmetic, that remains unchanged. It was a difficult situation for Theresa May, one that she was not able to overcome when she was Prime Minister. And it may come back to haunt Boris Johnson in his role as Prime Minister now.
Top of that, in tray, as he sits at his desk this evening, will of course be Brexit. That's what this last 3 years in British politics has been about. But in his speech on the steps of Downing Street, he also talked about the other things that he wanted to do. And there is a yearning in the UK, isn't there, to shine the light on the other issues in the UK that need political attention.
That's important for government, but it's also been something that's been important for the people of Britain, who increasingly have become disengaged with the issue of Brexit as the politicians have concentrated on the minutiae. They've talked about things like education, tax and the environment, and it may be that, that Boris Johnson hopes to win over some of those people by talking about domestic issues, while he hopes to win over those people that supported him for the leadership by concentrating on Brexit.
Let's talk about the international reception now, because leaders around the world, but particularly in Europe and the United States, will be watching the last few hours and Boris Johnson's first words as Prime Minister. In Europe in particular, how will his speech have gone down, do you think?
Well, so far the response from Europe has been very short. I would describe it as that. Donald Tusk, a senior figure in the European Union negotiations, has already tweeted out a message saying that he congratulates the new leader and looks forward to speaking to him. That's basically all that he said. In Europe, if Boris Johnson is going to strike any kind of deal, he has to start talking to those people. But there are only 99 days remaining till the 31st of October deadline that he himself set. And that's not a lot of time.
Joe, thank you very much for joining us. We'll have more of the developments on Boris Johnson's cabinet, which is taking shape even as I speak during the course of the evening here on CGTN. But for the moment, from Westminster, I'll hand you back to the studio.
Indeed, thank you for that. That's Jamie Owens, of course, there live in London. Quite a few cabinet appointments still rolling in. We'll give you updates on that, essentially in the current as the hour rolls on. Let's head a bit to Egypt now. Egypt's economic growth is expected to slow down to just 5.5% in the fiscal year that started this month, and 5.8% the following fiscal year. Now, those figures, however, are below the government's target. This comes as Cairo nears the end of an IMF-backed economic reform program. The forecasts were similar, though, to a Reuters survey of economists released 3 months ago, but fiscal 2019-2020 growth was seen as being much lower than the government's target of 6%. The country's Prime Minister Mustafa Madbouli said last week that Egypt's GDP was actually growing by 5.6% in the 2018-2019 fiscal year, slightly higher than the 5.5% expected in the April poll. Barring the oil industry, Egypt's economy has struggled to attract foreign investors since the 2011 uprising that ended Hosni Mubarak's 30-year stint in power. All right then, company news. Let's start in Zimbabwe. Delta Corporation, as the country's largest beverage maker, reported a 57% drop in first quarter lager sales. This comes as consumers cut spending amidst the worst economic crisis there in a decade. The Southern African nation is currently grappling with rocketing inflation, power cuts and shortages of just about everything from fuel to foreign currency to bread and medicine, and that prompted street protests earlier this year. Elsewhere, state-owned Ethio Telecom, a potential candidate for privatization, generated $1.25 billion in revenue in the last fiscal year. That's 7% higher year on year. Multinational firms are eyeing a slice of that massive telecommunication market and the telecom provider after Ethiopian legislators approved a law last month to liberalize the telecommunication sector, opening up one of Africa's last remaining state-controlled telecommunications markets. In Kenya, East Africa Cables and its parent company TransCentury have completed a debt restructuring transaction, which includes refinancing the company's debt. That's resulted in a 44% reduction in debt to the tune of almost $16 million and the extension of the remaining debt tenure to 10 years. Now, the transaction has also resulted in 2 years moratorium on principal repayment and 6 months on interest payments. So an 80% reduction of debt service cash requirement is also expected in the next 2 years. And finally, Tullow Oil, the independent oil and gas exploration and production group, announced its half-year results for the 6 months ending on the 30th of June. Now, the company reported strong financial delivery in the first half with robust profits and free cash flow, in its words. They posted revenues of $872 million, gross profit of $527 million, post-tax profits $103 million, free cash flow $181 million in the bank. That's a run through your company headlines. We're 19 minutes into the hour. You're watching Global Business Africa. Here's what's coming up next. Kenya gets a new finance minister a day after the incumbent was charged with corruption. And a year later, Uganda's government has failed to raise the targeted funds from its heavily criticized social media tax.
The world economy as we know it is about to change. Global business reports highlight emerging markets, developing countries, and dynamic sectors worldwide. We feature top analysts and newsmakers to provide perspectives on every facet of business. From an on-the-ground perspective, we provide you with balanced and objective assessments. Fast, sharp, and insightful. Global Business. Only on CGTN.
Economic data out of the country. The country's foreign currency reserves.
With a dedicated and diverse team of anchors, CGTN now brings Africa to the palm of your hand.
I'm Penina Karibe in the heart of Nairobi, which is bustling.
From everyday heroes to the continent's most powerful figures, we bring their voices to you.
We haven't changed, and this is something most of us are very excited about.
We bring you news that's changing perspectives.
I'm reporting from Nairobi City Center.
News that brings Africa to the world. CGTN. See the difference.
Africa is the nexus of enterprise, and Global Business will tell you why it matters.
From the mega investment projects to multi-billion-dollar mergers and acquisitions.
Africa today collects, just in terms of revenues from taxes alone, $545 billion a year. If you take 10% of that and you devote it to the energy sector, problem solved.
All this on Global Business, weekdays at this time on CGTN.
Welcome back to the program. Kenya's President Uhuru Kenyatta has named interim officials to run the finance ministry, a day after the incumbent finance minister was charged in court for corruption. The Labour and Social Protection Cabinet Secretary, Ukur Yatani, will now be acting as the finance minister. Yatani effectively replaces Henry Rotich, who had been in that finance docket since 2013. He pleaded not guilty barely 24 hours ago to corruption charges in connection with tenders for the construction of 2 dams. President Kenyatta has also replaced the second-in-command at the finance portfolio. Julius Moya, Dr. Julius Moya, I should point out, takes over from Dr. Kamal Thuge, who was also charged, alongside Rotich and 26 other officials. The charges related to financial misconduct and a conspiracy to defraud taxpayers in a multi-million-dollar dam project. Well, still in Kenya, the central bank has basically left its base lending rate unchanged at 9%. Banks will continue to lend at about 13%, well, for those who are lending into the retail market. The Bank's Monetary Policy Committee attributes this hold to what they described as contained inflation and a bit of optimism for future growth. Kenya's economy is forecast to grow by 6.3% this year. But according to a report by the country's statistics office last month, inflation actually accelerated by 0.2 percentage points to stand at about 5.7%. Growth in Kenya's private sector credit growth, that's essentially propping up optimism, if you want to call it that, for increased economic output. It actually grew at the fastest rate we've seen so far this year, 5.2% in June from a low of 4.4% in the month of May. All right then, so let's examine this in a bit more detail. Jibran Qureshi is economist in charge of covering East Africa at Standard Bank. Is with me in studio right now. Welcome.
Thank you, Rama. Thanks.
Okay, so now the policy vacuum at Treasury has ended. How are bonds trading?
So the hard currency bonds, the Euro bonds, actually were up today. Yesterday, I mean, once the news broke, they were slightly down, but nothing too material. Mm-hmm. But there's optimism that the Fed's going to be a lot more generous with the rate cut when they meet later next week. So I think that is supporting hard currency African credits across the globe. But I think, I mean, generally infrastructure bonds locally that the foreigners like have been quite steady. There's been a lot of liquidity, so there's not much risk there. Mm-hmm. The currency, I mean, everybody's concerned about the currency, but I guess we'll get into that later on. But I think it has nothing to do with the announcement that we saw a few days ago.
Because that's being driven entirely by fundamental factors as opposed to essentially what's happening on the political front.
There's not enough supply actually of dollars, I would argue. I think, yes, when you break psychological barriers, I'm not a big fan of psychological barriers, but when you do break 103.50, when you touch 104, people will pick up the phone and say, I want to buy dollars. But the fact of the matter is that we haven't seen enough supply once the STR ended, to be very honest, and of course the tea sector is not bringing in enough dollars at this point in time. So I think all those factors are leading to a bit of weakness in the dollar.
Right, let's focus on the MPC, holding the rate at 9%, no surprises over there, but a couple of other things they said were, well, rather interesting. So one of the things they said was they arguing that the economy is performing, in their words, close to potential. But incomes have been relatively stagnant over the last couple of years. We've not seen a huge increase there. Job creation is also not essentially advancing at the pace we'd expect it to be. Do you agree with this assessment?
Well, I've said on record, I think last month or the month before when they had the MPC, that I don't think the economy is performing close to potential. Yes, there's an inclusivity issue with very impressive numbers, especially the 6.3 print that we saw in 2018. If an economy was performing close to potential, you would see that sort of translate into slightly quicker, a slightly accelerated pace of core inflation. We're not really seeing that at this point in time. Neither are we seeing a very, impressive growth in money supply growth. So I don't think the economy is performing at potential. There's obviously a disconnect, as you rightly mentioned, between what's happening, the official numbers, and what's actually happening on the ground. And I think it's also being driven by a lot of the services sector when you look at the breakdown of the GDP numbers.
Okay, what about non-performing loans? Because it seems, at least looking at the latest data from the MPC, it seems like we've peaked in the month of May. That was 12.9%, then it falls down slightly to 12.7%. Yeah. But is that a true decline in the size of NPLs, or has it just been reduced because now we're seeing banks lending more into the market?
I think, it's both a demand and a supply side function. IFRS is behind us. I think most of the big banks took the hit through equity. Smaller banks was a lot more challenging for them, but they've got a bit of a grace period ahead. If we do three things in the next 6 to 8 months, if we repeal the rate cap or favorably amend it, if we begin to reduce the inefficiencies at the inland container depot in Embakasi and probably even the port, and if we start to release payments to private sector more consistently, if we do these three things, then I think that should embolden commercial banks to extend credit more wholeheartedly, if you like. And I think over time, NPLs have been sticky, but if these three things are behind us, I think we should see a gradual recovery. But that being said, a lot, Rama, depends on what happens in the next month or so with the finance bill and or the Banking Amendment Act.
In fact, that is my last question to you, because just to put this into context for our viewers, there are two completely opposing views of how to deal with the rate cap. So the finance bill is proposing to completely repeal the rate cap. The Banking Amendment Bill, however, wants to do the complete opposite, keep the rate cap in place and simply deal at the margins with the issues the court mentioned back in March. Which of those two are you putting your money on?
Well, look, it's going to be very difficult to see what comes through, but I am optimistic, dare I say cautiously optimistic, that we get something this time around. I've previously argued that we had the VAT on fuel last year, which became a bit sensitive or contentious for the executive to sort of exhaust political capital and where he wanted to amend what or bring in what reform. So I think we don't have anything too sensitive. If you like, some of the salary and allowances debates that are going on could be the quid pro quo, if you will, for some of these discussions. I looked at the order paper and some of the submissions. It looked like they have amended, quite simply some of the reservations that the High Court had. I'm still a bit confused about, the penal equity that they've tried to bring in with respect to, penalizing the commercial banks, but also penalizing borrowers, if they supposedly or presumably pay above the cap. So I think that will kind of become interesting. There was no indication I thought they would probably include fintechs, mobile lenders, but that
wasn't explicitly stated.
Yeah, the only thing that they've added is a bank and a financial institution. And if you look at the Banking Act, the financial institution is defined as an institution that's taking deposits. So maybe that could include SACCOs, who knows. But I think still a lot of ambiguity and still not very, very precise as the High Court wanted it. But again, I am a lot more optimistic last year that we get something because, again, as you mentioned, if we don't get it through the Banking Amendment Act, which, mind you, the President still has to assent to, then, of course, we go through round 2 with the Finance Bill. So if we don't get a total repeal, I think we could hopefully get a favourable revision. Like last year, we got the removal of the floor, but hopefully this year we could get an increase in the spread.
All right, let's see how this plays out. Jibran Qureshi, thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right, then let's move on to Uganda, right next door. 1 year since a social media tax was introduced in Uganda, the government over there hasn't collected as much revenue as it thought it would. It had predicted annual receipts of $76 million. It only got $13 million in the last 12 months. Now, the daily levy targeted platforms like Facebook, Twitter and WhatsApp, and it was deeply unpopular, heavily criticized by Ugandans when it was introduced. Here's CGTN's Isabel Nakiria with this report from Kampala.
Logging onto the internet without paying a charge. Many Ugandans are avoiding the 50-cent daily levy for using sites like Twitter, Facebook and WhatsApp. They are accessing social media using virtual private networks or VPNs.
For some of these people, their daily budget is round about that. It's like 200 shillings a day to be able to access these services. And now suddenly that is, almost 100% increase for them. So it's a huge impact.
Uganda's Revenue Authority says only 17% of the target for collections was achieved.
Most offices, corporate companies, where most people who use the internet actually have free Wi-Fi. So people switch to that public Wi-Fi.
The tax caused an outcry from many Ugandans who use the internet to run their businesses. Many young people took to the streets to protest the law. Artists who post their shows online say viewership has dropped.
Based on the numbers we had before the tax was introduced, it has come almost half. We almost had an average of around 50,000 viewers, live viewers, when we had our shows broadcast on Facebook and YouTube. But now it has come back, I think, to come down to 20,000.
Uganda Revenue Authority says it's looking into more innovative ways that could compel users to pay the tax indirectly. Uganda Revenue Authority hopes collections on social media tax will pick up once they intensify efforts to educate Ugandans on the importance of paying the tax. The government plans to use the money to roll out better and faster internet connectivity nationwide. Isabel Nakiria, CGTN, Kampala.
Right then, quite a bit of interesting things happening on this side of the world. A recent report by the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, ICIJ, shows that Africa's poorest nations are losing out on millions of dollars in tax revenues from multinational corporations. According to the data, wealthy individuals and firms are legally shifting these profits out of these African countries where they do business. Instead, they move that cash to the corporate tax haven of Mauritius, where foreign incomes like interest payments are taxed at an extremely low rate, just 3%, and that makes it a boon for corporations and of course for Mauritius itself. However, this tax haven in turn ends up being catastrophic for most of the African states that are essentially treaty partners because they've signed DTAs with the island nation. Right then, so how did we get here and how do we fix this problem? Alvin Mosioma is the Executive Director of Tax Justice Network, is with me in studio right now. Welcome to the program.
Thank you very much.
So walk us through the broad outlines of this investigation. What prompted you to do this?
You see, when you think about, there's a lot of focus about the need to attract investments. Our governments bend backwards in terms of doing everything within their power to draw investment. There's a huge competition globally to attract investments. And one of the instruments that can facilitate investments is double tax treaties, which in essence are supposed to facilitate or ensure that companies are not paying tax twice. They are not paying tax where they are residents and not being taxed twice basically from where they are registered as residents and where they are operating, where their business operations are.
Yeah.
So these double tax agreements are, in that sense, serve that purpose.
But they do have a legit, because the conundrum at the heart of this is that there's, all of this one is legal, and DTAs do have a legit economic purpose.
Definitely they do. Definitely they do, because you, as any other businessman or any taxpayer, you want to pay tax once for the kind of profits or income that you earn. So if you're a Kenyan operating in Tanzania, you don't want to pay your taxes in Kenya where you are a citizen and pay in Tanzania where you are a resident. So in that case, double tax agreement between countries are a good instrument to be able to facilitate investments. The problem is when there's an abuse through loopholes that are inbuilt into the double tax agreement that then lead to a situation where companies are not paying tax at all. leading to what we call double non-taxation. And this happens when you have one of the jurisdictions either having significantly low tax or no tax at all. And this is the heart of the problem. And in this particular case, Mauritius has positioned itself as a conduit, or as they frame it, as a gateway to investment, particularly to the continent. They have signed over 46 double tax agreements across the world, and majority of them with African countries.
Right. So what kind of damage is being done here? Because, I mean, looking at the documents that I've seen so far from the Mauritius leaks, like to use Kenya as an example, I've seen Umati Capital mentioned in the leaks. I've seen offshore funds that were basically set up for oil exploration offshore in Lamu. So in the Kenyan context, can we quantify the damage that's been done?
It's difficult to put a concrete figure on it, and I think, of course, this expose or this Mauritius leaks is just the tip of the iceberg. And we get to know it as it were with the Panama Papers or the Paradise Papers. These exposés happen when there's a leak, when somebody sends a flash disk or a folder to the journalist and tell them these are the things that are happening, and they largely is the tip of the iceberg in terms of characterizing how big the problem is. Largely, you know, tax havens exist to offer two things. One, they offer zero taxation or low taxation, or they offer secrecy. Very little information seeks through what is happening in those jurisdictions. So what that basically means is that for those unscrupulous multinational companies that either don't want to pay their fair share of tax, use Mauritius and other tax havens for that matter as a platform to invest into the continent.
Right. One last question for you, Alvin. Because these DTAs tend to be freely entered into after some negotiations by both parties, Mauritius and whoever is on the other end.
Right.
Doesn't this revenue leakage, though, suggest that the quality of teams we're sending to do these negotiations, that they're simply not up to par?
There are two problems. I think that is one, the challenge that many of our countries in Africa, the question of capacity to negotiate these very complex legal instruments. But also there is a question of political capture. In a process we call round tripping, where you find wealthy elites within a country wanting to actually move out of us and then come back to the country as foreign investors. We see, as an example, you might be aware that India, Mauritius is one of the largest investors to India. And not because they are rich Mauritians investing in India, but they are rich Indians who move to Mauritius and then go back to India as foreign investors. So there is also that kind of political push among the local business elite to be able to sign this kind of double tax account, because they know that they stand to benefit through this kind of round tripping.
All right, we'll leave it there for the time being. Albert Monsiamwa, thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.
Then. You're watching Global Business Africa. It's time for a short break on the program. Here's what's coming up next. We'll explore why the US Justice Department has announced an antitrust review of giant tech firms. And China's launched an overseas intellectual property right dispute settling mechanism. All that and more is coming up next.
Business in Africa is at a crossroads. We celebrate those who are adopting and thriving despite the challenges, from grassroots to big businesses. Global Business takes you along for the ride as we track the making of a giant. Only on CGTN.
How will your world change today? What happens here? What happens there? Or what you make happen for yourself? If it matters to you, it matters to us too. Your stories are the stories that need to be told. Africa Live. Find your voice.
Welcome back. The United States is set to start an antitrust review of major online platforms to determine if they have stifled innovation or reduced competition in the market. The announcement to that effect came from the Justice Department, but it did not name specific companies, but it did appear to signal that the department is targeting Google, Facebook, and Amazon at the very least. Now, these firms dominate key sectors of the digital economy and digital services really around the world. It was not clear, however, if the probe would also target Apple, which despite not being the dominant smartphone maker, does wield enormous power over services through its App Store. During a recent interview, Apple CEO Tim Cook was adamant that the company is not a monopoly, but he accepted that it warranted a bit of extra scrutiny due to its size. Right, then let's dig a little deeper into this developing story. Daniel Rangers is live with the latest on this from Washington, D.C. Daniel, the statement from the DOJ was very brief, didn't have any names in it. Do we know what triggered this probe?
I think that when these social media sites, retail giants, and search companies like Google first began, we were amazed by their capabilities and their level of innovation. Now we're beginning to be amazed by the degree of power that is being concentrated as a result of their dominance in their markets. Namely, in the words of the antitrust division, they are looking at search, social media, and retail. So, for example, in the case of retail, there is a concern that Amazon is just swallowing up all of the competition. It does what it does extremely well, but there comes a point, I think, when antitrust and competition becomes a concern if all of the innovators that could potentially come into the market are not able to do so because they are instantly swallowed up by these giants.
Indeed. So Facebook earlier today also fined about $5 billion by the FTC. Walk us through the details of that settlement that was arrived at between the two parties.
I remember talking to you back in 2011 when Facebook signed an agreement to basically say that they would no longer abuse the rules that they had in place for consumers to know when their data was being shared. Well, according to this settlement, they violated that, and that's why they're paying this $5 billion fine, which is the largest civil fine ever levied, and obviously also the largest ever involving consumer protection. Alongside that, Rama, they are also having to set up a whole lot of new structures. An alternative, a group of individuals whose only task within Facebook is to look at what the privacy policies are and how they're being rolled out. They have to release regular reports on their progress, which have to be signed off by Mark Zuckerberg, and there has to be also an independent auditor looking at all of this. So the agreement is a large monetary fine, but it also pushes Facebook to be much, much more responsible in the way that it deals with its data, especially after the recent scandal for the 2016 election involving essentially third-party friends of friends within Facebook having their information sold to other companies.
Indeed, I hear the arguments around privacy issues, but might there be a political angle to this probe? Because the president, for one, has been very vocal about his criticisms of Google and Twitter, essentially accusing them of silencing conservatives. Candidates running for nomination for the Democratic Party have gone as far as calling for the breakup of these large tech firms. The US Treasury Secretary earlier today saying that Amazon has basically destroyed part of the retail sector. Given all of these factors in aggregate, is there a political angle here?
I think that all sides of the political debate have some grievances with these large tech companies, and some of the ones you mentioned on the right to do with their perception that they are crowding out conservative voices. And then on the left, people are concerned about the heavy concentration of political and economic power that these companies have garnered. Look only at the furor over the second Amazon headquarters and the fight that was had in New York over whether this was creating economic distortions in New York itself. So there are many, many different motivations politically. But I think when you say, is it political? I think yes, but it's political in a good way, in that there is a broad spectrum of opinion that suggests that things should be done to break up these monopolies and make them think twice, because otherwise they're going to just be interested in their shareholders and gaining even more of a monopoly. And there is a broad public argument that that would not be in the public interest, and indeed by breaking up a monopoly you are spurring innovation for the future and incentivizing people to come along and do better.
Indeed, I'm glad you brought up the shareholders argument, because shares of these companies like Facebook, for instance, it's trading at the moment, it's up about 0.4%, 203 shares, $203 per share. But it's not just them. Facebook, Alphabet, Twitter, Amazon as well, all their shares are up. They're all in positive territory so far this year. Now, the nature of the DOJ's probe may be vague, but looking at these numbers, investors clearly aren't concerned, are they?
The basic challenge for this effort is this, that these companies have a lock on our data. They have incredibly sophisticated data collection. They know a lot about us. And breaking up a monopoly in the railroads or in the energy sector is far, far easier. We've never had a challenge like this. So, for example, if Facebook and Google are saying that they've got our data secure and that they're acting on our interest as the public wants, well, how does that conflict with the idea that other companies, in the end, in order to innovate, will need access to that data in some form? So right now, all of these major companies have got the lock on the data. That is the gold mine for the future, because with blockchain, with artificial intelligence, and all of these new technologies, they are pretty much useless unless the companies that use them have access to the very best data, which is still essentially a monopoly.
Indeed, let's see how all of this does play out. Daniel Rangers in Washington, D.C. Thank you. Now then, claims of intellectual property theft and unprotected rights have been a very thorny and very public issue in the China-United States trade conflict. As Chinese authorities announce a new mechanism to help settle overseas intellectual property disputes today, they also pointed to new evidence that China's IPR protection is facilitating a better business environment for both domestic and foreign enterprises. CGTN's Sun Ye filed this report.
China now has a national center to help the nation's companies navigate unfamiliar foreign ground when it comes to different IPR requirements.
The National Center for Overseas IPR Disputes will work on facilitating international cooperation in IPR protection. It will also help China's going-out companies better understand and observe IPR laws and rules when they operate overseas. It will also help companies understand their obligations and rights in overseas business environments.
The administration calls for better IPR protection on the home front too. It cites a more than 8% rise in patent applications and an over 15% increase in foreign companies' trademark applications in China in the first 6 months of 2019 alone, calling it a show of strong confidence.
The state of intellectual property rights protection has everything to do with the state of trade and business environment. Trade and investment can only take place under well-protected IPR. So, judging from China's recent performance in IPR protection, we have a good business environment that's attractive to enterprises, including foreign invested ones, and they are confident in China's business environment.
The World Intellectual Property Organization also rolled out its 2018 Global Innovation Index, putting China for the first time in the top 20. It rose from number 22 to number 17.
Sun Ye, CGTN, Beijing.
In South Africa, biomedical engineers have found a way to transmit messages from your brain into the internet. It's called brain internet. It's an interesting portmanteau of words, but it started 4 years ago, and it's the first step to understanding this fascinating human organ. Now, the brain connects the nervous system, controls the body, stores your memory, helps you think, but being able to access it directly could open up new frontiers for medical science and how we learn in future.
Imagine the possibilities if we could tap into the complex workings of the human mind without uttering a word or touching a keyboard. Wits University engineers have pushed the boundaries of science by transmitting brainwaves online and in real time.
I was on Twitter and I wanted to share my thoughts in a different kind of way. So I thought to myself, what if we could just stream biological signals onto the internet? So BrainTernet came about with that idea.
So we have a Raspberry Pi that then connects to a server. It then writes the data that it's collecting from the EEG that we wear on our head, which gets all of our brainwaves, it gets all of the signals. It then writes that to a database.
Researchers overseas are experimenting with microchipping the brain, but the Wits team went a step further without the use of invasive technology.
What was the first word that you guys could identify through this?
Okay, so we transmitted a word through this EEG device through the brain using light, and the word that we encoded was hello. The idea was we could transmit words from a first computer, computer A, to a second computer, computer B, entirely through the human brain by shining light from computer A into the eyes and then detecting that light effectively at certain frequencies at the back of the brain in the visual cortex through the EEG device wirelessly to computer B and then decoding the word.
So why is this so important to the human race? It could enhance learning, bring back memories and help people who are disabled or suffering from mental disorders.
We can look at the patterns the brain forms when it's in a depressive state, when it's in a bipolar state, when it's schizophrenic. We can then actually accurately diagnose people from the get-go, and we'd actually be able to say, cool, these meds will help you.
But it does raise questions around privacy, the vulnerability to hackers and health risks that come with tampering with the body's most vital organ.
We know so much, but yet so little about the mind. It's such a frontier for science and for humanity that it is a frontier that we need to tread very carefully and lightly with, because it is so powerful, and to disrupt one's own mind it can be irreparable.
It may sound like science fiction, but right now we already use smartphones and watches to monitor everything we do. Integrating these technologies to the brain could mean opening up an endless list of possibilities. Julie Shara, CGTN, Johannesburg, South Africa.
Right, then a quick update on commodity prices here for you. So Brent crude was in the 64s a little earlier on in the day, but of course that's been a bit volatile up and down throughout the day. It actually did drop back to about 63 later on. Gold still hanging on mostly to the gains from June. It was up about 0.38% at 1633 GMT. $1,423 a troy ounce is the relevant price we saw at that point in time. Now, let's head over to Egypt. Two businessmen over there are challenging Uber's dominance, effective monopoly really, for ride-hailing apps. The market has been dominated effectively by Uber ever since it bought out its Middle Eastern competitor, Careem, earlier in the year for just over $3 billion. Here's CGTN's Yasser Kim with the details on Grassroots tonight.
Dupsy and Wingo, two companies established by local businessmen, have announced plans to rival Uber and its subsidiary Careem. Marketing manager for Wingo tells us they are learning from the complaints about the current service providers.
We have some unique offers to attract the market share. From the drivers, who we call captains, we only take 15% of any trip, which is the lowest among all competitors. We also give the captain the option to pay a monthly fixed amount, and he or she can take all the income by themselves. As for the clients, we will not have the high fare or surging price during rush hours. Our prices remain the same all along. Of course, there will be discounts and offers, but no higher prices.
There are over 300,000 ride-hailing cars roaming the Egyptian streets, and about 4 million customers out of 100 million Egyptians. So there is potential for growth.
It's a big market, but the competition is fierce with the multinationals operating here. We are planning to launch with 12,000 cars in Cairo, Giza and Alexandria. We will gradually increase our cars in these 3 cities first before we move into other areas.
Previous attempts by other ride-hailing applications have failed to materialize. The demand on ride-hailing cars is increasing because of the outdated taxis and overcrowded public transportation.
The competition is good, and the market needs 4 to 5 companies to compete in providing the best services to the clients, especially that the taxi service has deteriorated.
The more the companies, the better. But there must be a strong supervision from the state to ensure that they comply with the rules and regulations for the client's benefits.
The ride-hailing rivals are also expanding into buses, motorbikes and food delivery services. Yas Hakim for CGTN, Cairo.
One last story for you. In South Africa, the retail giant Pick n Pay has introduced a plastic-free fruit and veg zone in more than 10 of its stores across the country. Now, the move is part of efforts to essentially test if consumers like you and I are ready to switch from pre-packaged food to loose products. With the details, here's CGTN's Julie Shire.
If you're a consumer like me who gets anxiety from seeing food wrapped in plastic, Pick n Pay's new fresh produce wall may calm you down. The retail giant has plastic-free zones in more than 10 of its stores in South Africa. You can also take your purchases home in brown paper or a reusable bag.
We have got different stores that we are trying it in, and because of the shelf life on the food, it was a bit of a challenge for us to do it as big as you maybe would want to see it. However, as we get to better innovation in terms of extending the shelf life on our products, then the wall will get bigger and bigger.
A growing number of smaller plastic-free grocers have cropped up in recent years, but many say it's a challenge to keep food fresh without plastic packaging.
Why don't we go for alternative options that are environmentally friendly? And the alternative options are there. It's just that the industry actually needs to make an effort and roll them out.
Many of South Africa's big retailers have also introduced recyclable plastic bags in the last few years, but it has not solved the problem of plastic waste. Just 10% of plastic is recycled. The rest ends up in rivers, oceans, or mangled rubbish heaps in landfill sites.
We do have a challenge, and that's visible in our marine life, that's visible in our landscape, etc. So we can't be dilly-dallying about the issue and hoping that starting small is going to solve the problem. We have to take bold decisions, and the willingness must be there.
Thanks, Lindo. Thank you so much. I'm making a conscious effort to avoid plastic, and even though there is a long way to go, this is a small step in changing consumer habits. Julie Shara, CGTN, Johannesburg, South Africa.
All right, then let's wrap up the programme with a run through the currencies for you today. So the Kenyan shilling, essentially hitting levels we've not seen since 2015, middle of 2015 really, going as low as 104.1 to the US dollar. In fact, from the 1st of March to date, the local unit has ceded over 4% to the dollar. Will that trend continue? We'll have to wait and see. But as far as Brexit is concerned, the sterling dollar pays an interesting reflection, if you will, of market sentiment. On the spot market, sterling was about 0.46% higher at 16:30 GMT, but it's over 2% in the red over the year. Where will it be by October? I'll find out and update you. In the meantime, that's it for this edition of Global Business Africa. As always, we'd like to hear your thoughts on the content you've seen on the programme in the last hour. Also, there's several ways of getting your thoughts back to us, all of them on your screens right now. I'm Rama Nyang in the Kenyan capital, Nairobi. The World Today is up next from Washington, D.C.